Well, welcome one and all to Bike Racing Without Mercy at Oxford University, where today we're doing science. Courtesy of Dave Dearlove, Dr Dave Dearlove. He doesn't like to be referred to as a doctor, but he is one. He's a proper doctor, so this is proper science, none of that bro science that you get used to. We're going to do a lactate threshold test and a VO2 max test. It's going to be super exciting. More to come when I've got all this mad stuff on. Here we go.
So now Dr Dave has got me ready basically for a trip on the London Underground. The test will commence. I won't be able to talk much during the test because of A, this, B, the intensity of the test, especially towards the end, and C, it upsets the results. So I'll report back and Paul is going to kind of show the suffering and a little bit of Dave's, I don't know, pain cave here as we progress.
Dr Dave's testing protocol involves a giant ramp of power increasing by 25 watts every 3 minutes until failure. It's very efficient for the body to produce energy using oxygen in the mitochondria cells in the muscle. Note, strength training does help create more of these little energy furnaces, but this does require a constant supply of oxygen. As the intensity of the exercise increases and oxygen becomes more scarce, plus for a number of other reasons, the mitochondria in the muscles become progressively overwhelmed.
Just starting to get to the business end of the test.
As the mitochondria are overwhelmed, the body resorts to anaerobic glycosis to convert muscle glycogen into energy. This takes place in the muscles and does not require oxygen.
So 300 watts. All okay? He's good.
The process of creating energy in the muscles causes more lactate to accumulate in the muscles. The lactate, however, is also an energy source, and it diffuses from the muscle into the blood and onwards to the liver to be converted into energy. But lactate is not a blank energy check, and there is a point where the accumulation of lactate accelerates faster than it can be removed and converted into energy via the liver. This is known as the lactate threshold. At this threshold point, we can assess the power being sustained and or the heart rate in order to consider this inflection point when setting our training zone.
We are still getting some high numbers now. Take the next one.
Good, Phil. Step up. 350 coming at you now. Good, nice cadence.
So well done. Good when you're in here.
Good, Phil. Dig in, dig in.
Lovely work, Phil.
Keep on top of that cadence. Spin, spin, spin. Dig deep. Yes, good job. Empty that tank. That's 1 minute of this step, Phil.
Well done. Let me take this off you. I'll press end on this and it will give you the ability just to spin it over. That was great work.
Dear me, that's horrid.
Horrid indeed.
Dear me. Didn't get as far into it as I hoped, but that was my own. I just couldn't turn the pedal.
Liquids.
Cheers.
So towards the end of the test, you reach a point called the respiratory compensation where your body, in fact you can see it on this graph, your body kind of takes over proceedings, and these points here are when your breathing rate goes beyond sort of exercise-induced hyperventilation, and you're just gasping for air essentially at the end, and there's very little you can do about it, and that's a really good indicator that you've gone to absolute extreme.
Yeah, I felt like if it had been autumn, I'd have been sucking in leaves from outdoors.
Yeah, and you can feel that when you're exercising. So you're breathing, even though it's fast before that point.
Yeah.
Still kind of within control. But it gets to a point just before you finish where you lose. It's just gasping.
Yeah.
Uncontrollable gasping. So that's a really good sign that you went to exhaustion. The other thing is that your lactate levels finished off at 17.7 millimoles. So that's gone from a range of 1.8 at rest to 17.7, and that's really high to achieve in a bike.
What does that mean?
So that's an indicator. So your body's always producing and recycling lactate in your system. You get, as you exercise, you produce more lactate, and that gives you an indication of the energy systems you're using. It means that you're putting more energy through glycolysis to create lactate. And at a certain point, so as you start to exercise, it goes up, but it stays relatively steady. And at a certain point, it starts to increase exponentially. And when you're getting up to the levels of 17.7 on a bike in particular, where you've got a limited number of muscles that you're using, highest, mostly lower limb, then that's a really high level. It means that you're putting a lot of emphasis on producing energy through glycolysis. And
do you think that's helpful? Strength training and muscle mass helps with that?
Yeah, muscle mass absolutely will. Yeah, more muscle mass, the bigger the capacity you have to produce energy, because all of the what goes along with muscle mass, or hypertrophy of muscle, is increased mitochondria, increased enzymes of metabolism, so increased ways to create energy.
So you heard it here, science. In the gym, get in the gym, train the lower body and the upper body. More muscle equals more mitochondria equals greater ability to produce energy.
I think one of the other interesting things, so we're taking glucose measurements during the test.
Yeah.
And this is on the idea of,
so
it's like a scrappy piece of paper.
Yeah.
But
that's how science is done, right? Pen and paper.
It's done on scrappy bits of paper.
Yeah.
But the idea is that, so there's a lot of interest at the moment in blood glucose monitoring.
Yeah.
And for good reasons. Glucose is obviously important, but really what you want to be able to measure is glycogen usage in the muscle, and obviously there's no easy way of doing that. So what we saw here is your glucose levels at 150 watts started at 4.5, and that's really low. Yeah. But you can see through the measurements here that actually the rate of appearance of glucose in the blood is higher than the rate of disposal. So more glucose is being put into your blood, predominantly from your liver, than is being taken out by the muscle.
Yeah.
So if you were monitoring your glucose in this sort of short, high-intensity exercise session, you gain nothing from that. All you know is that, okay, it's going up, so there's nothing to monitor here. As you extend the exercise duration, then yes, at a certain point you start to empty your liver of glucose, and the rate of appearance falls. It's still going down.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, for a longer climb to gauge where I want to ride below in terms of intensity.
So what we could do is, if we came back and did a longer effort, what we deem to be your threshold sort of level, then we can measure you, we can do respiratory gas measures, blood measures over that period of time, and see, okay, this might be good for 3 minutes. What happens if you extend it out to an hour? Is there a drift, and at which point does that happen?
That's what I love, so the consistency of the power and the climb.
Exactly, so
brilliant. Look, this has been an absolute, you can tell from in here and the voiceover that I thoroughly enjoyed this. I think you've got a test coming, have you, Paul?
Yes.
A little bit of that.
Once you've warmed down.
A bit longer, his test than mine. I now know why Paul's so strong on a bike. He's clearly got 2 parts.
certain point, so at the moment VO2, which is the volume of carbon dioxide expelled per minute, is linearly associated with the amount of air that he's expiring per minute, essentially, which is VE. At a certain point, you'll see an inflection, so this will go up, and that's the point that we call the ventilatory threshold or anaerobic threshold. It's got a few names, and that's when Paul will start to suffer.
We're looking forward to that. I think Paul's level of concern is now high. Yes. 42 seconds in. We're at DEFCON 1. Keep it going. It's a minute in. Piglet is a man of grit. Let's have a look at the graph. Look, really starting to take off in terms of the linear is broken. 4.2 on the 4.3 on the VO2 max. Keep it going, Paul. All kinds of grit. Come on, Paul. 29. You got a minute to go to get to the 400. Shooting upwards now. VO2 still 4.3. There you go. 45 seconds. 4.6. Plenty of glucose being used. Time for another ear piercing, Paul. 25 seconds.
Blood is moving very quickly now.
The blood flows quickly out of the ear at this level of intensity. 10 seconds, Paul. 10 seconds. There you go. 3. And here we go to 400. There we go. The 400 is on the board. Look at the man dig in. And look, we're going vertical here. 4.3. That's 30 seconds in. Keep it going. There we go. 4.7. This is huge, Paul. This is a big score. Coming up for 90 seconds. Look at this. Keep it going. 8 seconds until a minute, 2 minutes, sorry. Look at the cadence. Come on,
pick it up,
spin
pick it
out.
up. Come on.
Keep it going.
Chance to get to 425.
There you go.
Come on, keep grinding. Push, push, push. Okay, and in there.
Superb. You weren't able to talk there, were you, Paul?
Not too much.
Look at that, the lactate shot up, glucose usage stable throughout. Finally a piercing. So what do you see from the data here?
You both perform the same exercise protocol, right? So you start off 150 watts and increase by 25 watts every 3 minutes. And so you and Paul are different athletes and you go about this test in slightly different ways, but you can see that Paul is able to suppress his lactate levels for quite a long time. So it's only really at arguably 250 watts where his lactate is starting to rise. By that point, you're already at 3.9. Now there's some notional values that you can apply to lactate levels. So there are 2 lactate turn points, they're sometimes referred to as. So what I'll do is go away and actually plot this properly and look at your data to try and work out where these turn points are. But what you can do as a rough guide is say that roughly speaking, and this just to emphasise this is different between people, that 2 millimoles, the point that you cross 2 millimoles is normally the point at which you're going through that first lactate turn point. And that for Paul happens somewhere between 250 and 275 watts.
And I'm straight into it.
You're straight into it, and it does steady off there. So you know your baseline lactate level. So I should say with that one you'd been warming up a tiny bit on a notional number of watts. So that's probably not a real baseline. It would probably be closer to 1.2, but that's not abnormal.
Looking at the gas expelled during the test, this was calculated at 200 to 205 watts, where the glycogen is spared, with fat being the primary source of energy.
Somewhere between 1 and 2 is reasonable. But with you, there isn't that. So you go into your 2s, but it's a pretty steady increase, and then obviously as we get into the later intensities, it really ramps up. But it will be slightly harder to pick out where your turn points are. The other notional value that people look at is at 4 millimoles. So again with Paul, really late on before he reached exhaustion, and slightly less so with you.
Based on my lactate readings and the gas expelled in my breath, my lactate turning point 2 was calculated at 260 to 270 watts. This is some way below my 1 hour FTP powers, but of course I can tolerate a lot of lactate. However, Dave said that this disparity does need more investigation.
So, you know, this is one set of data. I wouldn't want to try and infer too much from it, but I think in comparison between the two of you, a couple of take-home points. Firstly, your maximal. So this was with Paul. This was actually taken properly at max. So upon exhaustion, this was taken a minute before max for you. But you can see your lactate, your maximum lactate levels that you achieved are much higher than Paul's. And whilst this test isn't perfectly designed to test your anaerobic capacity, so this might be an indication of your anaerobic capacity, so your ability to generate energy anaerobically, so outside of mitochondria. This test isn't ideal for determining that, and if you come back, then what we could do is something like a 90-second all-out test and see what lactate level you get up to. But my suspicion is that you'll be much higher than Paul, and that is indicative of probably your weightlifting background, I'd guess, and possibly a slightly greater muscle mass as well. But it would suggest that, you know, making very broad sort of statements around this single point of data, that you might be a slightly better sprinter than Paul.
A better sprinter than Paul?
I'd suspect.
A better sprinter.
That's not, in fairness, that's not
Not
hard.
currently. I think I need to train it, but definitely that's super interesting, because I've always told myself I don't have the aptitude for it.
A relative thing. But yeah, I think it would be interesting to repeat this. So if you've got a specific training block coming up where you're focusing on a certain type of training, then I mean, generally, the real value with these is repeating them and seeing how they change.
Yeah, and I definitely want to come back to do a repeat.
Your lactate threshold, it is actually sometimes referred to as your aerobic threshold as well. So your anaerobic threshold. They're all kind of interchangeable, or at least used interchangeably. Just based on this alone, so the respiratory gas data will be much better, because we're getting massive number of data points there, and here we're having to make quite big inferences between one data point. But based on this, you're probably going to be looking at somewhere around 225 to 250, somewhere around there. And we'll see if that matches up. That will be the one to go to as a sort of default.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Threshold.
My anaerobic threshold is calculated at 235 to 245 watts, and this is not to be confused with my FTP, because what we're measuring here is a physiological change in the body's use of energy systems.
And that's the point where I'm starting to use predominantly glycogen.
Well, not necessarily. That's the point. I would best describe it as that's the point where your ability to rely on aerobic metabolism becomes impaired.
Yeah.
So your ability to generate energy through your mitochondria, which are the aerobic powerhouses of the cell, at that point, for a variety of reasons, and it's not just because you've got a limited amount of oxygen that might play into it, but it's probably not the main reason. that becomes impaired, and therefore you have to switch to this other route to produce the energy that your muscle needs to facilitate contraction, and that's through anaerobic glycolysis. So you're taking glucose that's being taken out of the glycogen in your muscle and also taken up from your blood. But the downside of that is that the amount of energy you can generate per gram of glucose is much less. So it swings and roundabouts. There's we've obviously evolved these different energy systems, and they're very complex and they integrate with each other, but with the goal of trying to keep you exercising to a point.
And the VO2 max score, that was like 62 millilitres per minute, wasn't it?
My VO2 peak measures my maximum rate of oxygen consumption. It's largely genetically determined and measures the ability of my cardiovascular system to extract oxygen from the air and transport it into the muscles for respiration. This is an important predictor for both athletic performance and overall health and longevity. 62 millilitres per minute per kilogram is a strong score for a man of my height and weight, and it occurred at 350 watts and 171 beats per minute heart rate.
Paul, Dave, thank you very much.
No problem. Pleasure.
Thank you for organising this, Paul. Dave, thank you for being so welcoming and accommodating. I have learnt an absolute ton from you today.
That was fun.
Yeah, well, huge fun, but very, very informative. Anyway, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Take care. Cheers, Paul.
Because it's genetically determined, it's very hard to increase your VO2 max, but training will deliver some incredible fitness adaptations, and Dave prescribes a polarised approach to training with the intent of increasing your ability to clear lactate at ever higher powers and to generate a higher power at each turning or inflection point. So here's my training zones prescribed by Dave. At very short notice, I decided to enter La Marmotte in the Alps and therefore use Dave's prescribed power zones in order to experiment with the powers I intended to deploy on the clients.
We're just coming to the end of my last roller session here at the apartment. Feel a little bit sad, but it's been a good one. I feel like I'm floating on the pedals. The first 1 hour block was zone 2, zone 3 overs and unders, average 238 watts. 5 minutes recovery, then 32 minutes, zone 2, zone 3, over and unders, average 243 watts, and just rounding off here with 20 minutes, zone 2. Currently, average 227 watts.
Well, that was a lovely way to sign off my final training here at the apartment, and therefore it was a good day to experiment with a couple of things. Firstly, dial in the pedalling technique, and I got a left-right balance here. Let me have a quick look there. Of 50-50. There we go. So that's 3 in a row on the left-right balance at 50-50. So definitely the roll is paying big dividends here. But more importantly, this was my final training ahead of going out to La Marmotte. And I wanted to experiment with the powers I intend to target on the climb, i.e. the Glandon, Telegraph, Galibier, and also Alpe d'Huez. And as you just saw there with Dr. Dave at Oxford University, with the mask on, to calculate VO2 max, but also the blood test to look at the lactate in the blood and sugar levels in the blood. Dr. Dave reckoned that my anaerobic threshold, sometimes referred to as the VT2 threshold, the point at which the mitochondria lack any more capacity to create energy inside the mitochondria, and therefore the body has to resort to creating energy outside the mitochondria in the muscles through the process of glycolysis to convert glycogen into energy. He felt that in reality the blood indicated that I was using the process of glycolysis predominantly to create the energy at around 230 to 240 watts. Therefore today was the perfect day to experiment with the anaerobic threshold power range prescribed by Dr. Dave, i.e. 230 to 240 watts, staying well away from my lactate threshold. It felt good, therefore I reckon Dave's advice is good advice. And you can see here that overall training just under 2 hours. Average power 237 watts, including the recoveries, normalised 239, and left-right balance 50-50. There we go.
And whoever you are, and whatever you do, please remember to live, thrive,
and stay healthy. Thank you.